Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Monday After Homecoming. I hope you're all rested and ready for our next talk today. Dr. Pedro Larrea is going to talk a little bit about the Wizard's Manuscript and word alchemy in the Poet's Stone. Dr. Larrea is in the Department of Spanish, Foreign Languages, Modern Languages, excuse me, and he did his PhD at University of Virginia. And we're excited to hear his talk today. So everyone, Dr. Larrea.
Good afternoon to you all. It's great to be with friends, basically. So thank you so much for coming on a Monday at noon, when we have so many things to do. Thank you. I will not read all the time from my books because I can get boring, very boring. I did that already during the Thornton reading a couple of years ago. But I want to take this time to talk to you about the origins and the influences of my poetry and my idea of poetry. When I was preparing that, I started brainstorming, and like many other things in adult life, it took me to my childhood, and I started trying to remember, when did I start writing poetry? When did I even know what poetry was? When did I start systematically reading and trying to learn how to write poetry, not only how to read it? So I brought a couple of stories and a couple of images that will help me share that with you. But first of all, I want to show you the first two. They're not the first two books that I ever read. I wouldn't know those. They were probably children books. But these are the two first classic books, great books they used to be called, but let's just call them classics that ever came my way. My mother already had a couple of papers that I apparently had written as a child. She still keeps them. I cannot make her give them to me so that I can burn them, but mothers. So she told me that I had already written something, and my mother could not study. She couldn't even go to high school. But she had a good perception. She has always had a great perception. So she thought maybe he will be interested in books. So she took me one day to a department store in Spain called El Corte Inglés, the English fabric or something like that. And she took me to the book section. She told me, well, choose two. I'll buy you two books. She didn't know much about it, so she read in a section clásicos, right? She says, okay, it must be here. So let's see it. And she just let me basically choose. I had no idea, so these are the two ones that I chose. The first one, Chrétien de Troyes, Percival. This is the one I loved the best at this moment out of these two, because it was all the stories about King Arthur and the Holy Grail and all that. So from this one, I got the story, the plot, the characters, the fantasy. That really enticed me. This one, written original in Spanish, I didn't understand a single word. It is El Mejor Alcalde del Rey. It's roughly translated as the best mayor is the king, by Lope de Vega. Lope de Vega, something that shocks me, is not very well known in the English world, in the English-speaking world. It is humongously known in all other literary worlds in the planet. Basically, he is our Shakespeare, as to speak. And obviously it was written in verse. I had no idea what that was. I just saw that there was a lot of space to the sides of the text. And it didn't make much sense because it was, 16th century language, Spanish language, which is, by the way, not as hard for a present-day Spaniard as it is for an English to understand, let's say, Chaucer or Shakespeare. But the music, it had rhyme, it had pattern. It had something that I had never encountered other than in songs. So I made an effort to try to understand. It took me a couple of years when I was already in high school, but this was the first time that I consciously read poetry and decided, I like this, I'd love to, I don't know how, reproduce this feeling that I have with music. So these are the origin of me writing poetry. My ideas of poetry are, if I had to choose between the romantic or the classical school, I would say romantic. I believe in the power of the word to convey through imagination an openness of new routes to knowledge and feeling and discovery. And for me, one of the stories, I was educated in a Catholic school. I'm not a Catholic, I'm not a believer anymore, but I was literally very highly educated in all the stories and the lore. So the one that impacted me the most, because it had to do with language, was the Curse of Babel, La Torre de Babel, as we know it in Spanish. And these fragment for Genesis really shocked me as a child. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven." This idea of reaching somewhere that is unreachable, actually, I think it's at the core of poetry. And the title of this talk has to do with the poet's stone, as I hope a clear reference to the philosopher's stone of the alchemists. Poetry for me is like an alchemy. We know we will never reach heaven through language, but nevertheless poets have been trying and will always keep trying. We know we won't arrive, we won't get to heaven. It may never exist for that matter, but we keep trying. We keep trying to dig in the darkness of the unknown through word and pattern and rhythm. So another highly influential story to me, because that question, like, why do we speak different languages? And especially now that I have for almost 20 years lived in a linguistic environment that is not my native one. And it's hard, believe it or not, everything I say, I have to think about it more consciously. It is a torture. It's been lasting for 17 years, but here I am, doing my best. Apologize for my accent. There we go. Now, there are several layers of what poetry is. I don't want to say that these are the 5 things that help me or the practical reasons why I write poetry. I don't think there's a practical reason for poetry, and I think that's why it's so important. Poetry is an understanding of things. It is not the same if you ask me to describe a chair that if I think about a poem where I want to talk about a chair. This object was one of the first ones I saw in a museum. It's in the British Museum. It impacted me because I remember when I studied in school, the art book was humongous and the picture was huge. So I thought that the item, the artifact itself, would be huge. It's like this. I think it's like this. It's not bigger than this. And this fascinated me too. The whole thing, they actually deciphered the hieroglyphs to this. It was a Frenchman. What does that mean? Okay, that we can now read the hieroglyphs from the pyramids and the stela and all that, but what did that imply? Or what did that mean to me? That we started understanding stories told by a people that we didn't know. We know their monuments, we know a little bit of their history, but we didn't know how to read what they actually wrote in the language. I think poetry is more or less like this discovery, this finding a key, not necessarily to understand a language, but to understand the world around us, or to give an explanation. We can give an explanation about the wind. We can explain it from a science point of view, or just when we're talking about the weather. But if we want to describe, or not to describe, but to convey what the wind may mean for a human being in a specific moment, linked to sadness, linked to a memory, linked to a body temperature that connects with the heart of an experience, that needs poetry. That needs the language of poetry. Now, in that way, that's an explanation. It's a lyrical explanation. It can be also a revelation. One of my favorite poets, as I will show in a second, were the mystics of different traditions. Obviously, since I'm a Spaniard, the great school of mystic poets appealed very much to me, and then the whole connection with the Dervish Sufi ceremonies of the Sufi mystics. and that actually gave me an alternative to religion, because it was at a time as a teenager where I was already questioning my faith and my beliefs. So finding that, for example, St. John of the Cross or St. Teresa, they actually wrote things that you didn't have to believe specifically in a specific figure with a specific name or God, but in a space, in a place beyond, as a metaphor, as a symbol, that unreachable thing that you try to reach perfection or the union with God, you never actually achieve it, only maybe for a couple of seconds, and then that's it. So how they link that to the physical experience of human love, that was, basically, they describe the union with God as a huge orgasm physically. That's why the poetry is like the Song of Solomon, in that sense. There's a lot of sensorial images, a lot of food, a lot of flesh, and all of that to convey the union, of the bride with groom in this sense. Poetry is similar to that. It's obviously an art and a creation, and I love the idea of creating something that didn't exist before. Back to my childhood, I didn't have a happy childhood. I have always been a happy person, but my household was hell. There was not a single person but my mother that I wanted to be with. So my childhood and my teenage years were a long process for me to actually grow up and leave. In that sense, poetry was also my happy place, because I was creating not only a poem, not only a writing of some kind, it was a space that I inhabited. That's why my first poems are very, I would say within poetry, if I wrote prose, I would be writing fantasy, or science fiction or something like that. That would be the equivalent of what I wrote. So, in that sense, many poets will say, poetry saved me. No, poetry is my mom saved me. But poetry helped me to actually find my space, my own. And it's always been like that. Now, let's see. I'm gonna skip this because this is too bad opening, to a new world that we didn't know. And one of the things that also shocked me when I was learning literature was that poetry was universal, in the sense that all cultures, or most cultures, an overwhelming majority of them, had some form of poetry, whether written or oral, most of them oral. When we start to decipher or understand other cultures and other languages, and we start to compare mythical stories and origin stories, what shocked me very, very happily is that we basically have the same pillars for civilization. One of them was the flood, the story of the flood. It's everywhere. It's everywhere, but we didn't know that it was everywhere until the 19th century, approximately. That's when we discovered the tablets of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, and there must be thousands of them waiting for us, but it is in modern times such a conflictive area with war and invasions and conflict that it's not the time or the place for archaeologists just to try to find tablets. But this common story was for me in a clash with the idea of the curse of Babel. How was it possible that we humans could tell the same stories if we didn't understand each other's languages? That paradox has always fascinated me. Now there are, not this one, sorry, I explained that already. Along with poetry, as an adult, I have devoted a lot of efforts and time to become a literary translator. Because translation, the act of translation, literary or not literary, is for me parallel to that search. I translate from several languages into Spanish. I translate from English, French, Italian, and Portuguese to Spanish. I'm starting with Mandarin, but I can only translate menus so far. But my aspiration is that in 10, 20 years I'll be able to engage with that. But translation is, in a way, trying to say something in your language that doesn't have and will never have an exact equivalent in comparison to the other language. In that sense, poetry is like translation, and I discovered when I was in college this theory of translation that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe had about how that process works and how cultures have started translating very rudimentary other cultures, other languages, and how that process has been refined. So in Goethe's mind, there were like 3 stages where translation happened. One of them was, okay, so we don't know anything about this culture that we just discovered about. So we need to understand, first of all, what are they saying? What is the message? What is it that they convey here? What were their beliefs? What did they eat? Like more like an archaeological interest in texts. The second stage would be when history has developed a little bit. There has been already some kind of historical contact between those 2 cultures. And we understand the other culture because we have encountered it already, but we still do not completely comprehend the essence or the nature of their way of life. That will be reflected in our second translation. There's a third one already accomplished where we do not need to find examples of our own culture to explain that other culture because we already have enough knowledge or understanding or empathy to that other culture. I have an example of these. So the first stage, I choose Don Quixote, obviously I'm a Spaniard, as an example. This is the first ever translation of Don Quixote to Japanese. It's a 19th century edition. I do not read Japanese, but I have friends who do, because they're Japanese and they know Spanish. But there's a fascination in Japan about all things Spanish, and that came through flamenco. We don't really know why, but there are more flamenco schools in Tokyo than in Madrid or Barcelona together. This is a fact. So the translator didn't really know Spanish. They kind of like remade the story to make it fit actually a Japanese folktale with a character that is actually kind of like a dwarfish kind of character. Made half samurai, half a crazy man that goes out there, but it still has all the appearance of that Japanese folk character. There's nothing here that you could, without knowing Japanese, point out as Spanish or as related to Don Quixote. Now these would be the first translation. My friends have told me that it really is a rewriting. It's not a translation. It's an adaptation because Japan and Spain did not have any contact since the 16th century. So we don't really understand here. Now, the second stage, this is the second translation of Don Quixote to Japanese, and this is an illustration contained in that edition. In this case, we see some things Western, not only Spanish and not only European. So, for example, we can see the helmet. Okay, well, they chose a Greek helmet, an ancient Greek helmet to represent. Okay, well, all right, it's Western enough, Greek, cool. But what about the shield? The shield is African, but for the Japanese editor, it was just West enough to be Spanish. No? So that's why this is a motley of different elements from different cultures from what for the Japanese was the Far West. The clothes of Sancho are a traditional Chinese, and I'm blanking out on the name of it. But it is a Chinese. It is just a Chinese set of clothing. In Spain, we never had this kind of like what do you say, like airy, like our clothes have always been usually very tight to the body. And then, well, yeah, we have windmills too. I think the windmills are probably the most, which is interesting by itself because these windmills were, in the times of Don Quixote, an import from Holland. We didn't have these, so it is, in that sense, the least Spanish one. So, but, if we compare that with these, well, yeah, if you ask me what world classic this is, I could have more chances to guess it than this one. Finally, we have the third phase or the third stage of understanding. This is when history has developed, both countries have established international relations, there have been an exchange of workers, immigrants, students, etc. And now we can more or less understand the foundations. This is a recent, I think it was from the 70s or the 80s, Japanese translation of Don Quixote. Obviously, if you ask a Spaniard what book this is, you know it's Don Quixote. It has the same set of armor that, sorry, I'm taking something for granted here. Philip II, a king of Spain in the 16th century, was famous for one armor that had been in many different conflicts and wars. So it was more like already like an artifact. That is the same armor that Don Quixote is wearing in this cover, which is absolutely, it makes absolute historical sense, because Don Quixote would wear something like this. Also, the barber Bastin, bowl, let's say bowl, with that part that is missing. So it's specifically. So in these three stages, have been more or less my acquaintance with words, with language. Trying to understand that language is not only something practical is hard for many people, because language is, in essence, a practical tool. We use it to communicate essential information for our survival. But this other function, this gratuitous, this non-necessary, in a way, non-evolutionary use, physical use of it, was what enthralled me. So this is like the quest to go from here to here. Instead of translation, we can think as these three stages of poetry to get to acquaint yourself with a language that, we don't know it. We just are born in, if you're born in Spain, you learn Spanish. If you're born here, you learn English. So it's a path you have to follow. Now, I want to share with you a couple of influences in my poetry. Not necessarily only literature, but sculpture, art, and other cultures. It is very hard to explain or to share the culture of my country with people in general, because especially in the Anglo world and in the United States in particular, there are a lot of misconceptions that come from historical stereotypes, usually negative, that have actually been prolonged in Hispanic Americans, and you can see that every day outside here. Spain is a very, very complex culture made of many different cultures. There is a map here. There's a map that I use with my students. I ask them, okay, so let's locate Spain in the map. Now tell me, what does Spain have around? What can we tell? Why is it different in its location to countries? So little by little, they realize that, hey, it is between two different oceans. Those two oceans mean different histories and different cultures. Spain is also the most mountainous country in Europe, with the exception of Switzerland. That means that it is a very regional country, meaning we have a lot of different customs, regions. There have been historically many different kingdoms that have been basically isolated because of the mountains. It's hard to dig a mountain to create a road. That's why even today we have so many different cultures. Some of them have never been in the Americas, for example, or never participated in the colonization and conquest and exploitation of other countries that Castile, the Kingdom of Castile, did. So it is the same thing with poetry. The very first Spanish art item that I remember from school is this sculpture. She's La Dama de Elche, the Lady of Elche. These are the native people of Spain, the Iberos or Iberians. They didn't have that name. The Greeks called them like that, the Iberians, therefore the Iberian Peninsula. And guess why I loved this sculpture as a child? I'm a child of the 80s. Princess Leia. Interestingly enough, I read an interview with George Lucas saying that he was inspired by this sculpture to create that image of Princess Leia. Something crazy. But I liked it because it has a secret. I couldn't find a picture that actually shows it. So when you go to the Archaeological Museum in Madrid, you can see this piece in the center of a room, so you can actually walk around it. It has a huge hole in behind where they found her ashes. She was an Iberian princess. And that hole That secret, now, for me, it has to do a lot with language, with the language of poetry. It is not the same thing to say tree when talking about, let's say, the Dell. It's like, oh, I love the trees here. Then actually take the tree and put it in a poem, and that tree can become what have you. It can be the tree of knowledge in Christian tradition. It can be the Yggdrasil in Scandinavian tradition, etc. It gets symbolic. It's the same thing here. I was always fascinated. I need to recognize, I need to accept that when I was a child, I was kind of infatuated with this princess. It was a beautiful. So this would be like the native culture of Spain, the natives of Spain. Then Spain was, like most countries in the world, conquered and colonized by other cultures. This is not a history talk, but I will just fast forward to almost the year 1000. This is what Spain looked like in the year 1000. To the north, just little Christian kingdoms, and the Greek area is Muslim Spain, called Al-Andalus in Arabic. Muslim culture was in Spain for over 800 years. That made a huge impact in our language. And it's wrong to say in our language. They were Spaniards too. Spain is not only the modern country, but it's how we refer to the historical area. So this culture, in a way, by conflict and by alliance, merged with the previous culture that had been essentially just Roman and Visigothic, Germanic. Now, this means that we have a lot of different languages in Spain. When you learn literature in school, we don't learn these languages, but we read the poetry of these languages. Today in Spain, there are 4 official languages and over 32 regional dialects and languages that are not official, but people speak. All of these come from a different degree of mix of linguistic cultures. Now, the first poet that we preserve from Spain is Seneca, a philosopher, but also a poet because he wrote tragedy, and tragedy in the Roman world is essentially written in verse. We do study Latin in school, many years. I remember 4 years in high school and then another 4 years in college. So there was a time back in the day, once upon a time, that I could read this. Without a dictionary now I could not. But the Romans were the first poets that I read when I read Spanish literature. And Seneca was from Cordoba, present-day Cordoba, enthralled me because he is a tragic, but at the same time he's content. He's one of the masters of the Stoic school. I'm not a Stoic, and I think that Seneca is not within the ethos of the entire Mediterranean. I think he was a Sandman. He was probably a Germanic guy that moved to the Roman Empire. No, he's not. And I'll explain why in a second. Now, Lucano, I'm going to spend another cultural difference, and a cultural difference between Spanish culture and more Northern European cultures is the casual use of explicit words to make humor. So there are things that my grandmother says, jokes that my grandmother says that a trucker here would never make in public. So this poet, Marcial, as we call him, Marcialis, was a humor poet. No? He wrote a lot of attacks to other people through poetry. This was totally new for me. I was like, okay, I thought poetry was like to, you write your feelings. But feelings were just love or desperation or sadness. Humor was not in the catalog for me. And then I discovered it with Marcial. I just got this, I translate this, not my words. But his Papylos, who was he was a political adversary, Your nose and your dong are both so long that your nose smells when your dog swells. Your dog swells. It's interesting because Latin doesn't have rhyme. But the humor in English is partially because of the rhyme. I need to say the Latin is even more explicit than that. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Another thing that in literature class is learned in Spain by all of us Spanish children is what is the first text that we preserve from in Spanish. And this, I think, is symbolic of how Spanish culture has developed being so adamantly Christian Catholic. The first text we have is, I want to move, but I know that if I go, are some annotations to a Latin book. This is the place where it is. It's a monastery in northern Spain. That is the text. The main text is Latin. I think, if I remember well, it is from Pope Gregory. Not written by him, but like the text. And then, in that little annotation, there is a translation of the text, which is in Latin. Now, this moment is when there was a monk, that knew that out there, people didn't understand Latin that much. Only monks still. So he wrote a very rudimentary version in vernacular, or the language that would eventually be Spanish. It's a middle stage between Latin and Spanish. And that text is actually a poem or a prayer, depending on how we look at it. That's the original Spanish. This is modern Spanish. You can see a lot of Arabic words too, and Jewish elements, because Jewish culture and Arabic culture are totally ingrained in Spain and in my idea of poetry too. So it is similar. I'm not going to translate it all to English, but it's a slimmed down version of the Our Father in English. Our Father, that prayer, yeah, more or less. So I love this one, because when I discovered this one, I still prayed, and I found it very beautiful. And I saw a difference between the prayers that we used to do that were systematically recited without we children knowing what we were saying. But this one was the first one that I read and spoke to me. It's like, okay, I'm not just saying this because the nun here is telling me to say it, but because I am genuinely attracted to this text. There's something here. There's something spiritual here. Oh, oops. My favorite poems ever in the history of Spanish were written originally in Spanish, but with Arabic script. What you're seeing here is a classic poem of Muslim Spain, where they had a golden age in culture. That one is written in Arabic. Now, take a look at those 4 lines there. It's actually 2 lines, cut into distichs. That, in spite of being Arabic script, is Spanish. There was a custom in Arabic classical poetry where you would write your main poem in classical Arabic, and then as a gift, or as like a secondary text, it's like, okay, here's the big poem, and here you have like a little piece. It's like when you go listen to the Fifth Symphony, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and then afterwards they play like a little theme before you go. That's, how do we call that in English? I'm blanking out. Un bis in Spanish. When a musician or singer does a song that was not supposed to be sung. There you go. An encore. So these poems were like an encore in Spanish, a language that was, part of their population, actually slaves and servants, were actually Castilian Spanish. So they spoke in Spanish, and it was there was something that they found cute, I guess. So they always included that, and we have a lot of them. And these are the first poetry and literatures written in Spanish ever. So one of my favorite ones was actually written by the great Jewish poet Yehuda Halevi. And well, let's see. There's no English here, but this works. Yes. So there are many words that are similar to those today. Hermanelas, hermanas, sisters. Let's see. Yo, I, vivré, viviré. So you can see the Spanish here, but you can also see the Arabic, Yarabi, instead of Dios, instead of the Latin one. Mama is Arabic for the mama, madre. And then, where's it here? My favorite one, Habib. It's very used these days in Arabic. It's friend. But at this time, it meant special friend, sentimental friend, lover. So there's a mix, and there are a lot of Hebrew elements here too. This mix of elements was so fascinating to me. And I need to say, remember that I'm between being a child and a teenager, I don't understand half of this. The meaning, the message, or what they're conveying, I have no idea. But this entire mix of languages or ways of saying from different people that are just put together in the same place by history, and they have to live together, and still they get to create beauty together in their languages. That just blew my mind. I wanted to do something like that. This is a model from the 11th century that was later kind of like covered, made a version of, by our great poet Federico García Lorca. It's a famous song about death in Córdoba. Beautiful. This is the Mosque of Córdoba, another of my inspirations. Córdoba is one of my happy places too. And it's an example of conflict too. But when I was younger, I saw it as a positive thing. As you can see, that's the interior, that's the exterior. If you look at the interior, that's definitely Muslim. It's a mosque. But if you look at the outside, you'll see that there's a Christian cathedral built on top of the mosque. It's not really on top, they're mixed. So you're walking there, and when you get to the Christian part, you actually see a cathedral. Today, this belongs to the Catholic Church, and there's conflict. That's not the point of this talk, but there's a conflict like, Muslims says like, hey, this is the second biggest mosque in the Arabic world. We want it to be a mosque again, or at least to have, to share. And Christians don't want to do it. So no, it's ours, because before you guys came, there was a previous church that actually existed in the underground, blah, 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 blah. For me, that didn't exist yet, that idea of the conflict. It was, these two cultures put together, living together. I was still too young and too naive to realize that that's conflict, that creates conflict. Not only just, it's like Thanksgiving, right? It's not like, hey, here's the food, oh, great, welcome. No. There's a dramatic story behind, a tragic story behind. But it was, for me, an aesthetical model. Another poet that I love is Ibn Hassan of Córdoba. Córdoba is like the capital of the world. One of my favorite actors, Sir Alec Guinness. I think it's in Lawrence of Arabia. When Lawrence of Arabia is visiting him in his tent, they're talking about civilization, and they're talking about London. And then Alec Guinness, who actually plays, and that wouldn't happen today, he plays an Arabic prince, says when London was a small, nasty village, Córdoba had already a street light, or something like that. That's what Córdoba is for the Muslim Spain. And all these poems had something in common. This one, and the Hebrew, and the Arabic, and the vulgar Spanish. Vulgar meaning, in linguistics, it's the evolution between Latin and what is Spanish. They were put to music, and that also, fascinated me. I didn't know how to play an instrument. Nobody did in my family, but I got a little guitar, a very cheap one, and tried to learn the rudiments of it, because I actually wanted to sing my poems when I started writing. So there's one that I want to share with you, even if it's only one or two. Let's see if I can play this for you. I don't know if the audio's gonna work. It's just a song about three Moorish girls that the poet sees, and they're sisters and they're beautiful. That man there is the pianist. It's a recording by Federico García Lorca. We don't perceive his voice, but we perceive his playing. He was a pianist in the Forbidden Poet. Ask any Spaniard about this song or this poem, everybody knows it. We learned it by heart in school. Another poet, a favorite of mine, is Ibn Salah of Seville. And this one started appealing to me because I was in high school, I just entered high school, and I was already exploring my sexuality. And I was already paying attention to eroticism and to that kind of symbology and metaphor. Ibn Salah of Seville is one of the most enthralling erotic poets ever that I have ever read. I understood the profound connotation of physical relations, and that went beyond the superficiality of, just superficial sex, I guess. I would see it like that as a teenager. And I saw for the first time sophistication in that here. These, actually, even Saul of Seville would take me to San Juan de la Cruz. This is here. It's Charles Heston. I'll explain why. Where are you? I have so many. I'm not going to show everything to you. Sorry. Come on. There we go. Here we go. San Juan. San Juan de la Cruz is probably the favorite poet of most Spaniards, even if they're not religious, because he wrote the best love poems. This has always been the archetype of best poetry for me. I always try to, that utopia I was speaking before, that wanting to reach heaven, we know we won't. Like alchemist. An alchemist finds or tries to make gold out of lead. They kind of like try to find this chemical process to attain that. They were not naive. They knew that they would never gonna make gold out of lead. However, they insisted and they kept exploring. Why? Well, because they discovered other things, other metals and other processes. So that gold was actually a symbol. Many people today think that they were actually trying to make gold out of lead. They were not that innocent, in spite of being a long time ago. They knew it was a metaphor. It's a metaphor to find something unattainable, but it's worth it to try to follow that path. That's basically the essence of the Spanish mystics. Probably the strongest influence in my own poetry. St. John of the Cross wrote a very short poem, probably like 6-7 small stanzas, following the model of the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs. And he changed the characters of the bride and the groom to Jesus Christ and his soul. Now, in Spanish, we have gender. Words are highly gendered. So what he does is his soul, he makes it feminine. So that's the bride, and the groom is Jesus Christ. So the story is, and this one I have a translation in English, and it's very short, so we can read it. The original, I'll read afterwards. There's a girl. His soul, which is a she, is the voice of this poem. So, on a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, oh happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. It is at night. In darkness and secure, by the secret ladder disguised, oh happy chance, in darkness and in concealment, my house being now at rest. In the happy night, in secret, when none saw me, nor I beheld aught, without light or guide, save that which burned in my heart. This light guided me more surely than the light of noonday. It's obviously the light of faith from a religious point of view, but it is usually body love too. We'll see in a second. To the place where I knew who, this is Jesus Christ, was awaiting me, a place where none appeared. So in this poem, Jesus Christ is like a secret lover that the soul has outside of her house, meaning outside of the world, outside of the common day, outside of the physical world. O night that guided me, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that joined beloved with lover transformed in the beloved. This is so beautiful in Spanish that it is so sad that the English is not. That's not a very good translation. Upon my flowery breast, kept holy for himself alone, there he stayed sleeping, and I caressed him, and the fanning of the cedars made a breeze. The breeze blew from the turret as I parted his locks. With his gentle hand he wounded my neck and caused all my senses to be suspended. That's an orgasm, if I ever saw one. I remained lost in oblivion. My face I reclined on the beloved. All ceased, and I abandoned myself, leaving my cares forgotten on the lilies, which are white. This poem, I still think, is the most beautiful thing ever written in Spanish. Will you allow me to do it in Spanish? So that you can see how it's, now that you know what it says. En una noche oscura, con ansias en amores inflamada, oh dichosa aventura, salí sin ser notada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. A escuras y segura, por la secreta escala disfrazada, oh dichosa aventura, a oscuras y encelada, estando ya mi casa sosegada. En la noche dichosa, en secreto que nadie me veía, ni yo miraba cosas sin otra luz de guía, sino la que en el corazón ardía. Aquesta me guiaba más cierto que la luz de mediodía, a donde me esperaba quien yo bien me sabía, en parte donde nadie parecía. O noche que guiaste, that concept of the dark night of the soul comes from this poem of Don Juan. Pope John Paul II wrote his dissertation about that. Oh noche que guiaste, oh noche amable más que la alborada, oh noche que juntaste amado con amada, amada en el amado transformada. En mi pecho florido, que entero para él solo se guardaba, allí quedó dormido, y yo le regalaba, y el ventalle de cedros aire daba. El aire de la almena, cuando ya sus cabellos esparcía, con su mano serena en mi cuello hería, y todos mis sentidos suspendía. Quedéme y olvidéme, el rostro recliné sobre el amado, cesó todo y dejéme, dejando mi cuidado entre las azucenas olvidado. It's so musical. It's so beautiful. And if you can read Spanish, this form is so exigent. The rhyme, the pattern of the meter. Very, very few poets have been able to write good poems with this form. His grammar is like he's not even trying. He just comes out of his fingers. By the way, his fingers, it's Catholic, right? It's the Catholic world, that's the relic. Those are the fingers of San Juan that were preserved when he died. The fingers that he wrote this poem with. I'm not into these things, but there are people who find this very, Let's see. We have 10 more minutes. Well, I just want to share one more influence with you. This one, yeah. One of the most beloved poets of the 15th century in Spain that we all, again, read in school and memorize, is a poem about death. And death, and I've spoken about desire and love and knowledge and trying to find something beyond. All those things I had already kind of like beheld in my brain when I was a teenager. But when I was finishing high school for the first time, I started thinking about death. Not as a bad thing or a good, just nobody died in my family or nobody that affected me. Like, I didn't have any like traumatic experience with death. But I realized that there were a lot of poets talking about it. This is a poem that a poet from the 15th century Spain, who was what everybody else was, a soldier back then in the Reconquest, he wrote for the death of his father. So it's like that kind of lament. And the first stanza is very, very like, I can't describe it, but it's very, very moving because it's very sad. He really depicts his sorrow for his father, but that's not what makes you, which makes you shake and tremble. I think what does is the lyricism, the sweetness of that feeling. It's not like dramatic death. Oh my God, my father has died. He knows his father has died. He was an old man. He has accomplished many things in life. Now he's going to reflect on death, taking the death of his father just really as an excuse. These two stanzas are probably the most famous. Oh, let the soul her slumbers break, let thought be quickened and awake to see how soon this life is past and gone, and death comes softly stealing on, how silently. The poet, the translator in English, who I think was Auden, not sure now, has actually respected the pattern and the rhyme of the original. That was very good. It's a very long poem, it's like 50 stanzas. And it's available online. I recommend you to take a look if you are interested in this kind of poetry, obviously. I had many other experiences and influences and favorite authors, but since we only have 5 minutes, I would say 5 minutes left, I just want to share one of my poems with you. I'll read first the English translation. By the way, I have to mention this, if not my editor will come in. The translator is Dr. Benjamin Eldon Stevens from Trinity University. And I think he did a great job. So I'll read the poem in English so that you know what it says, and then I'll read the one in Spanish so that you can appreciate the sound a little bit. Let's see. I dedicate this poem to my wife's grandfather. He was a Christian Arab born in Jerusalem before the Second World War. His family, they were just shepherds outside of Jerusalem. And when the British left, they pretty much left a mess in what they called the British Protectorate of Palestine. Basically, all the people there were left countryless, and they lost their British passport. Now, this man became a refugee. He was a teenager. He had never studied, learned to read or write. So he and his family seek asylum in the United States. He got it, only him, not his family. He was actually taken to Texas and given papers there. So he started working. He wanted to study. He felt very ignorant, especially in America where everybody read and wrote. So he knew that opportunities were based on education. He learned to read and write. He went to night school, and he finished his high school degree with such great grades that he was offered a scholarship to study whatever he wanted at the University of Houston. He had excelled in math, so he did aeronautical engineering. Sorry about my pronunciation. Aeronautical engineering. To make it short, he excelled. He was hired by General Motors to design a couple of innovative motors. And somebody saw him there, and a federal agent of some kind, and came to him and offered him something. Said, "Look, we're putting together a program to reach the moon, and this agency is called NASA, and we need to develop some motors that can put men up there." He was hired by NASA, and he was the man who, one of the leaders of the team that developed the Saturn V rockets. You can see one in the Johnson Space Center in Houston. So he basically created the rockets, he and his team, that put us in the moon. And I wrote this poem for him. It's when the Syria war started and the bombing started. The English says, "The cities should not burn. Burn instead the bread ovens and street lights, the fuel used by gardenia delivery men." And I forgot something. I have the text here, so just in case you don't understand my very poor accent. So, at the end. There we go. "The cities should not burn. Burn instead the bread ovens and street lights, the fuel used by gardenia delivery men, and the tiles underfoot, orange in the morning sun. The cities should not burn, because the city is a high-spirited zebra, an offering of shadow and light necessary to placate the jaws of the lion, humankind. The cities should not burn, neither the one with a pool of milk for bathing unicorns, nor the one populated by scorpions and tentacles that would devour them. Neither the tower nor the word should burn. Death should burn, along with its geometry. A body should be newly molded to remember, all on its own, how to reach the marsh that hides the salamander of breathing. Armor should burn. Rectangles should burn, but the cities should not burn. No deberían arder las ciudades, sin los hornos de pan y las farolas, el combustible de los repartidores de gardenias y las baldosas naranjas del paseo con sol reciente. No deberían arder las ciudades, porque una ciudad es una cebra fogosa, una ofrenda necesaria de sombra y luz para aplacar la mandíbula del león humano. No deberían arder las ciudades, ni la que tiene piscina de leche para baño de unicornios, ni la poblada por escorpiones y tentáculos que los devorarían. No deberían arder ni la torre ni la madriguera. Deberían arder la muerte y su geometría. Debería moldearse un cuerpo nuevo que recordara por sí mismo cómo llegar al pantano en que se oculta la salamandra de la respiración. Deberían arder las corazas, deberían arder los rectángulos, pero no deberían arder las ciudades. That was it. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Sorry that it took me a couple of more minutes than I expected.
Any questions for Pedro?
Yes.
I'm just kind of curious if you talked made it very clear that translation can be dangerous work, right?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of historical context and cultural understanding and all those things. And it seems to me that, I mean, it may be elementary, but it seems to me that adding poetry adds another level of complexity in terms of lyricism and rhyme. And so I'm just kind of curious what you think about in terms of those trying to balance, you know, which is more important, or is that kind of even a moot point because you just strive to do the best you can?
I think translators have to be humble enough and only translate genres that they have themselves practiced. I only translate poetry because that's what I am. I'm a poet. I don't translate fiction because I wouldn't know how to write fiction. I have translated so far a couple of American authors, Rita Duff, Kevin Young, Joy Harjo. I only translate basically women and basically Native American and African American. That's a choice of mine. In all these times, I have to struggle not only with the text but also with the culture where it comes from. And also I have to think about the audience that is going to read this Native American poetry or this Afro-American poetry, who are people who know close to nothing about those cultures, not European Spaniards or Latin American Spaniards. Poetry is always a disappointment in translation, I need to say. I try to avoid reading in translation. That's why I'm obsessed with learning languages, because I do really want to learn poetry in the original. I can only do that in 6 languages, and it's very frustrating. And I cannot do it in a language that is not a Western one so far. So I have never been happy with my results as a translator. I've done it. I have given my translators to my editor. They have come out, great reviews and everything. It's always a frustration, up to a point where I always, after publishing one, I always consider seriously to stop translating because I don't feel honest entirely. Poetry, everything is a challenge in translation, but poetry is, I don't know. But the reason why I do it is because I learn a lot as a poet myself, not only as a translator, and that helps me. How can you translate the word tree to a different language? It may mean something totally different. Maybe in that culture, a tree is something negative or something sad in itself. Not for us. For us, it can be whatever we want to link it to. So how do you get all that? The last book I've translated, E.E. Cummings' Viva. I don't know if you know any E.E. Cummings deeply, but it is impossible to translate. Everybody says this about everything, but these guys, impossible. He cuts words. He creates words. He, like American friends of mine cannot read the original. My wife reads my wife who is American, and English is the only language she speaks. She can understand. It's a devotion. It's a military order. It's a knighthood. But it's super hard. The hardest thing I've done, other than quitting smoking. Quitting smoking is the hardest thing I've done, and the best. I'll be happy to answer any question. Also know that we Spaniards have less sense of privacy, so you can ask me personal questions too, that's fine.
I just have a question, kind of
Yep.
feedback off that. I like how you built your influences and how your personal enjoyments of what you read, and you tied it to how it creates your work. When you're translating, how do you get that intimate with the work or the culture you're reading when you have 17, 18 years developing your influences, right? What's your method for getting there in your translation beyond the language to the culture?
I translate languages from cultures I know directly, because whether I have studied them deeply or because I have actually lived in the countries. I translate from the Italian, I've lived in Italy. I translate from France, I've lived in Paris. I translate from English, I've been here 17 years. I do not translate British authors though, not because I don't understand them, but because it makes more sense for me to translate American literature. It is highly important. You may understand the language, but not the culture, and therefore your translation may not be successful. In fact, it can be wrong. There are also some things that you can say in the language, but you can't in another. We were discussing that before, right? That happens in poetry. There's one word, for example, that is taboo in America. It's a derogatory word for African Americans, the N word as they call it. It is not derogatory at all in Spanish. It is spelled the same, it is pronounced the same in Spanish. Nobody has any will to insult anybody. Historically in the language it's just the color black. But it's the same word that in English is specifically that way. How do I translate that? For example, Rita Gray, one of my favorite poets. She's an African American poet, and she uses that word in books where she deals with racism and history in the civil rights movement. How do I translate that to Spanish so that it's impactful? I cannot translate it simply as the word that actually means that, because in Spanish it's not it's not shocking. It's just a common word that everybody uses. There's some dead ends there. So what you do is you choose a word that is actually bad sounding in the language that is receiving the text, even if it's not specifically of that culture or specifically of that historical moment. But the guys reading that translation are not going to understand. They're going to totally miss the heavy weight of that word in the original. So I am very an absolutist in this. You need to know the culture. You need to have read the literature written in that language. You have to read, or at least know, the specific influences that that poet specifically has read. So if I want to translate Rita Dove, first I read her entire works, all of them, even if I'm not going to translate them. And then, if I am privileged because I have been able to befriend or to know personally all these poets. And I always ask them directly, what did you read when you were educating yourself as a poet? What specific books took you to write this specific book of yours, and so forth? And I try to always follow that mental process that they do, both culturally, just because they're born here, and specifically in their lifestyle. Why did you read that specific book? I am super, how do you say, fanatic in that sense. The only way I'm a fanatic. So. Mm-hmm.
And I would think in modern day, it isn't just their written and read influences, but it could be their impressions of the times.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're looking at social commentary in a lot of poetry.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of time getting to know that author, right? Like, what did you think about this event or that event?
Mm-hmm. I don't ask so much about their impressions of a historical fact, but why they were interesting for them to write poetry. They could have written journalism or non-fiction, but they decided to choose poetry. That's what I need to know to include in my translation. It is, I'm lucky, in a way, translating American literature to any other language is, I would say, easier than doing the opposite, because everybody knows, more or less, or is familiarized with American pop culture. So if you ask an Italian or a Vietnamese or a Argentinian what the Korea War was, we know it. Even if it has nothing to do with us, we know it. America, the United States, is like depending on your political inclination, the strongest power in the world, a superpower, an empire, however you want to have it. So everybody knows. Everybody has to know. Everybody has to read about the States. Everybody has to know what's going on there, what they're doing. How is that going to impact my country? How is that going to impact my families? So movies, music, all pop culture that explains or helps understand American culture of the 19th and 20th century. People who are educated from other countries have that under their belt already. So when I'm writing, I know that my audience knows American history, at least the basics to understand my translation, the cultural context. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Pedro.
My pleasure. Thank you.